Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Now, in previous shows we have discussed NASA's Apollo moon missions and presented a comprehensive set of evidence suggesting the Apollo crafts did not land on the moon. If you contend that statement, then please watch these two Rich Planet TV shows and see if you still hold that view after you've watched them. Now, in recent months, I've been collaborating with researcher Douglas Gibson, who has been investigating more of NASA's claimed projects, namely the Mars exploration missions. Starting in 1976 and up to the present day, NASA have allegedly landed a series of landers and rovers on the Martian surface, which have allegedly sent back photographs and other data to the Earth. Now, I've been working on a hypothesis with the help of Douglas Gibson, which is now running at 50 pages, and you can download it from this link. And it is entitled, A Hypothesis: The Opportunity and Curiosity Rovers Are Situated on Earth. In fact, more specifically, the Mars exploration rovers are not situated on the surface of Mars and never left the Earth. As I say, you can download this 50-page document, this hypothesis, from the link on the screen. How many other TV shows would you get a 50-page hypothesis of evidence to back up what we're talking about? Now, here to discuss the claims in the hypothesis is researcher Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Richard.
Okay, now I mentioned the moon there, Andrew, and you're, I would say, convinced as you can be that the Apollo never went to the moon. And we've gone through a lot of that evidence as to why you think that. Where do you stand on these Mars missions, Andrew?
Well, it's very interesting to think about because, you know, I have done talks about the Mars missions as well, as you probably know, and some of the viewers perhaps have had a look around on the websites and stuff. So it's kind of, you know, once you've broken through the Apollo barrier, if you want to call it that, and you realise that there's no possible way that they could have done what they did, what they claim to have done on the moon, then, you know, you do have to open up yourself to the idea that perhaps because of similar complications with technology, maybe these rover missions, you know, are not as claimed, certainly not as claimed. Mm-hmm. And kind of, I suppose, you know, you've rightly gone forward with your document mm-hmm. to try and explore where we get to when we look at the evidence and try and study it a bit more deeply with this deeply skeptical mindset that we come to, having found out some of the huge problems with the Apollo record.
I found the more I looked, the more the official version of the photographs, the official story behind them, started to fall apart. Right. And it's been 18 months now, and everywhere I look, it's the same as the Apollo missions. I know most people still believe we went to the moon, but if you look really carefully at any single aspect of the science, it just comes apart.
In the introduction, I set out the reasons why the reader should not just dismiss this hypothesis, because a lot of people will do that. And the reason they'll come up with is they'll say, well, why would they do that? There's no logical reason why they would possibly fake a mission to Mars. Well, let's look at the evidence before we decide why they've done it. Let's look at what happened before we look at why they may have done it.
Always a good method, yes.
Yeah, so investigation before condemnation. And we're going to do some of the investigating today. We'll just start by having a quick look at previous alleged missions to Mars. Now, we've got, from 1964 up to the present day, we've got a lot of attempted Mars missions, the majority of which actually failed. Yep. Most of these were either flybys or orbiters, and we've got a number of craft which are currently allegedly in orbit around Mars. It's all in this table on the screen there, and we've got a number of craft which have landed on Mars, starting with the Viking Mission in 1976. Just tell us a little bit about the Viking Mission, Andrew.
Yeah, so the Viking Mission arrived in Mars in 1976, consisted of 2 orbiters and 2 landers, and they were landers rather than rovers. So they, you know, once they got onto the surface, they stayed in the same place. Mm-hmm. Those missions cost $1 billion. Mm-hmm. So, you know, going back to 1976, that's an awful lot of money. Mm-hmm. And they had colour cameras on them. They had a laboratory, chemical laboratory built into them. So one of the projects was to send an arm out into the soil, dig some soil, pull the soil into the, or dust, whatever you want to call it, pull it back into the probe and drop it down into like a sort of chemical analysis laboratory. And they did this labeled release experiment and so forth. So, quite sophisticated probes. The missions we were told they were a success. Everything worked. They landed where they were supposed to land, and we got quite a lot of good quality pictures from them.
Right.
It was that mission which first photographed this alleged face on Mars from orbit, not from the surface. They photographed that from one of the orbiters in the region became known as Cydonia.
All right, well, we'll come on to some of the photographs which appear to have been tampered with from the Viking mission. Now, they conked out in the early 80s, they lost their power, what have you, and then we've got a gap up until the mid-90s where we have Pathfinder, and you can see the various different sizes of what were called the Rover missions. So these are vehicles which can allegedly move around the surface of Mars, starting, as I say, with Pathfinder in, I think it's 97.
That's right, 97.
Right, okay, so that only lasted for a year or two.
Yeah.
Then we've got another gap to the mid-2000s where we've got Spirit and Opportunity, which were a pair of rovers, which lasted lasted a good number of years. In fact, the Opportunity rover is still allegedly active. Is that correct? Yeah. So that's, we can see on the screen there the Opportunity rover, and then we then had the Phoenix
lander.
That was just a lander.
That's right. That was, that only operated, I think, for about 3 months or something. You've got that on your graph there. So,
and then the most recent one, which is Curiosity, which we're going to look at the Curiosity and the Opportunity rovers, which are allegedly still
sending back pictures from Mars. Allegedly, yes.
And moving around the surface of Mars. Now, we're just I've got a section on the power ratings of the Opportunity rover, and in the document I compare it to a mobility scooter, because the weight of the Opportunity rover is 185 kilos, which is probably two largish people. So it's reasonably heavy.
Yes.
So you would imagine, if you were to compare it to, let's say, a mobility scooter, which I think is probably a good comparison.
Yes.
Obviously, things weigh less on Mars. I think it's a factor of 2.6 times less on Mars. So it's maybe not 185 kilos equivalent load, but a mobility scooter maybe has let's say an 80 kilogram person. It's comparable. Now, a mobility scooter typically consumes around about 500 watts of power. Now, the Opportunity rover is rated at just 100 watts, which is no more than a sewing machine. So, in the other thing which I go into detail in the document is how the batteries are charged with just 2 solar panels, which are delivering just 100 watts only for 4 hours a day, and this system has lasted for 10 years. Now, just think of your laptop battery, right? Because it's probably comparable. Or maybe something slightly larger. It lasts in 10 years of charging and discharging.
The life of the batteries, because the Opportunity rover is supposed to have been roving around on Mars now for 10 years, powered by one rechargeable battery.
Lithium-ion battery.
Yes, and since when did those last 10 years?
You take those power figures and it does make you scratch your head a little bit. Of course they will argue, well, you've got highly optimized electronics and drive systems, and we use very low friction bearings in the motors, it's been specially designed for this project and so forth. But when you do the numbers, you start to, like you say, the 100 watts for 4 hours a day, and then also the solar panels, if they're providing 100 watts of power allegedly for, as you say, 4 hours a day, it doesn't seem very much. And also the thing that came into my mind is these things are on Mars, so the sunlight is going to be 20, 30, 40% weaker there. Allegedly the atmosphere is more dust laden, so how much more efficient have those solar panels got to be than they would have to be on Earth.
I mean, here's another interesting fact. The rover's operating temperature is -40 to +40 degrees centigrade. So presumably they've been tested to operate in that range. The average surface temperature of Mars is estimated to be -55 degrees C. That's the average temperatures of Mars. At the equator, which is obviously the hottest point, temperature varies from 20 degrees C maximum to -73 degrees minimum. so the temperature that they're on Mars at, -73, is way below the minimum operating temperature. So,
and that's right. And then you also consider it in terms of, if anybody has ever taken their radio out into cold weather, or a torch, trying to switch it on, you'll find that the battery performance at those sorts of temperatures is very much reduced. And it's literally got to put it in your pocket to get the battery going again with a pocket torch or whatever. Anyone can try that. So how are they getting this power system to work?
So the types of batteries used is a lithium-ion battery. So it's nothing special. It's what you would find in a lot of laptops and mobile phones, and it's lasted over 10 years being charged and discharged probably every day.
Yeah.
And they're only charging it for 4 hours a day with a 100 watt max probably solar panel. So,
and I mean, I've pointed out with the Apollo missions, the Apollo rover that they used, the battery technology on that was operating way out of the specified temperature on the high end, on the moon, and that's in their own documents. So yeah, you've got some serious questions here, certainly.
And if we just go back to the comparison that I've made in the document, imagine putting a mobility scooter on the moon, right, with a couple of solar panels on it. How long is it going to last without plugging it into the mains? I don't buy it.
Right.
All right, let's have a look at the Curiosity Rover. Now, this is a different beast altogether. It's much bigger, more sort of the size of a car, much more highly powered. And this is the one that there was big fanfare a few years back when it allegedly landed on Mars, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But it uses a different power system, Andrew. This is using some sort of nuclear. Isotope power system.
The system, as I understand it, is basically uses some type of thermocouple, doesn't it? Where you have the cool temperatures on the outside of the vehicle, and then you have the warmer temperature, which is created by the radioactive decay from the isotope, and then you have a thermocouple set up between those 2 points, and that provides a current from the temperature difference. That's my understanding.
So
that works.
Right. I've said here, while it seems plausible that a radioisotope electric generator could provide enough energy to power Curiosity Rover, the Opportunity Rover seems unfit for purpose by comparison. So let's just talk about the testing of these vehicles, because I've worked in my career as an engineer for the best part of 20 years and been involved with a lot of testing of products. And what I set out in the document is the philosophy that you use when you test products, is in that you have a separate test department and design department, and they're not really supposed to collaborate with each other, because you look at the requirements of the product. The test department will have its own engineers who devise the test procedures and carry out the tests separate from the designers, because there's always a chance that both sets will interpret the requirements incorrectly, and therefore it will pass a test without complying with the requirements. So there's all these things, and the videos that I've seen put out by NASA, there just seem to be one big happy family there. It doesn't seem that they're doing independent type of testing that I could see in their videos.
Well, they appear to show some scientists working hard to develop the rovers, but there's absolutely no documentation, no film footage of any of the development stage, or very little documentation and footage of the development of the rovers, and particularly across the landing stages. I think it's the Curiosity Rover had a very complicated 6-stage landing procedure.
That was, we were discussing this earlier, and it does, I mean, from the videos they put out, it does look more like a PR exercise, and sort of, patting themselves on the back, rather than some type of rigorous, type of audit test where somebody is actually pinning these people down and checking that the systems meet the user requirements, and that these systems are working as designed. I
would expect a device like a rover to probably have several test specifications, each with hundreds, if not thousands, of tests to test against mandatory requirements, all signed off. But all we've got is a few videos from NASA. We can look at this one that they put out, which was the drop test.
Oh yeah.
So we'll just have a look at this now.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
So big fanfare, but what actually happened in that test? We saw something kind of blow it to the ground. Now, I've worked on systems which lower nuclear weapons into Trident submarines, right? And when we're testing that type of equipment, they're operating within, let's say, certain acceleration parameters and velocities. So you don't know that the thing's passed the test until you've got your test data back. Because what we used to do when I was at the Faslane nuclear base, we put a 125-ton bag of water on the end of a crane and we'd drop it and then see if the braking system worked, and the accelerations would be measured, and then you wouldn't know until afterwards it's passed the test. You certainly wouldn't stand there clapping your hands. So it just, I don't buy it, you know.
It's right. I mean, if you watch that video, which I think is the test of this so-called sky crane drop mechanism which was allegedly used in the landing of the Curiosity Rover. Yeah, I mean, it's like, oh, you know, it's like they've set up this rig, they've dropped something down, and they're looking up, oh, it hasn't broken. You know, therefore it's passed the test. You know, so that's what it looks like to us. I mean, you know, again, there may be things that we can't actually see, but why can't we see more of those? Somebody, you know, going through a list of checkpoints, you know, on a list, or like you say, measuring the acceleration of this component and, you know, the stress on that component, you know, what have you. We don't really see that, certainly not in the video. So again, and I think one of the things we're talking about, Richard, isn't it, is having some type of independent verification of NASA's claims.
Now let's come on to the outside area where they've allegedly used to test some of these rovers, known as the Mars Yard. So we'll just put some photographs up on the screen, and it's not the most impressive test site in the world, is it? I mean, what are your thoughts on it, Andrew?
Well, like you say, I mean, you know, it's one of those things, a bit like the Apollo pictures. When you look at them, they seem plausible. When you look at this, it seems like a plausible test area. But when you were pointing out, for example, that your own experience of going on test sites for some of the projects you've been involved in the past, and I've been on one or two of those sorts of projects as well, probably not to the extent that you have, but yeah, it's true. You would have some more. You'd have more security. You know, you'd have more equipment sort of set up. It doesn't really look that
as you said earlier, you're talking each of these rovers, whether the test rover or the actual rover, you're talking multi-millions of pounds each. So there's not even, doesn't even look like there's any security there, so someone could just come in and steal it. So it just doesn't look like a comprehensive environmental testing site to me. Right, well, we've yet to come on to the most damning evidence, by the way. I mean, this is really just background what we're discussing at the moment. A rocket was launched at Cape Canaveral on the 26th of November 2011, and it got to Mars in August 2012. And this was filmed, or the Curiosity team sitting behind their consoles, which I find a little bit intriguing, because you've got all of these operators sitting behind consoles, supposedly looking at different parts of the mission of this craft as it's going towards the surface of Mars. But we know that a signal from Earth to Mars takes at least 3 minutes, so that's 6 minutes to get there and to get back. So if they were to modify any sort of part of the mission, it's a 6-minute feedback loop. So they're not looking at a live image. So I would have thought the vast majority of the program to land the thing, or if not all of it, would have to be completely pre-programmed and automatic. So I asked the question, well, what are all these operators doing?
If there's some buffeting in the atmosphere that this thing is going through, and they need to respond to it, well, it's going to be 6 minutes later when this thing's already gone thousands of miles off course and potentially crashed. So they must have done some very good modelling and had a lot of good data as to how that thing was going to come down. I mean, I think when they have the press conference, which we're recommending that people watch that that landing press conference. We're going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. But they say, I think within that, they say they landed within about 50 metres or something, or 500 metres of the target area, which is, if you're going all the way to Mars, that's pretty incredible.
Right.
You know, are they just good engineers and skillful people, you know, with mechanics and so on? But
there is a video which allegedly shows the craft kind of going down to the Martian surface, and then there's another photograph which they claim to be Curiosity Rover on the end of a parachute. So how would, because people who would say that these missions did land on Mars, they would cite these two pieces of evidence, both the video and the photograph of with the parachute out taken by a Mars orbiter. In
some ways, the difference between the Apollo deception and the Rovers deception is CGI, which is why the pictures we're seeing now are so much more convincing. JPL themselves, the Jet Propulsion Lab, have actually developed software called Virtual Presence in Space technology, which is cutting edge CGI, beyond anything we've seen in the movies. Isn't anybody wondering why?
There's a conference, and I recommend you watch the whole conference, and this was the 2012 landing briefing, so it's the conference after they've supposedly successfully landed the Curiosity Rover on Mars, and one of the main speakers there was this guy Adam Steltzner. So they were being asked questions by the press, and let's just have a look at this little clip of Adam Steltzner, who's one of the lead engineers. I think he supposedly devised the
sky crane,
the method by which the thing is actually landing.
That's right. He was the guy who sort of pushed for the sky crane system to be used. Yeah.
Right. So let's just take a look at this.
Adam, tell us about the landing.
All right, Greg. I can't tell you too much about it. I mean, it looks good. I'm being a little flip. In short, it looked extremely clean. We touched down in conditions that were on the more benign side of our nominal expectation. By the way, I want to preface everything. This is preliminary data scooped with the sieve in the cacophony of the control room during the celebration, right? And largely by my good friend Miguel San Martin, who's somewhere out there, I hope. At any rate, very nominal, remarkably good. Our navigation error was on the low side of our expectation.
What? I have to ask you, what kind of file type? Can you tell us about the image file type and compression that was used to send this very important couple of thumbnails back from Mars?
Yes, unfortunately, I absolutely cannot. If Justin Mackey is in the room, or there's a couple other people on the team who'd be able to whip that out quickly, but I couldn't tell you. Sorry.
So the guy, he doesn't even know what format the images are in that have been sent back to the Earth.
There's no evidence of any real science going on there, as far as I can see.
I would expect someone who's the lead engineer on that project to know every single minute detail about the file formats, the software, everything. He should, and it appears to me that he knows nothing.
It is very strange when you listen to what he says, and I think the argument would be made that he wasn't responsible for the imaging technology that was used. He was just responsible for the landing mechanism. Even so, I would expect him to have an interest in the imaging technology, because that's what his lander is being used for, to get the images, for heaven's sake. So you would expect him to be interested more enough to be able to answer that question. In fact, that's a theme in that question and answer session, isn't it? There are several questions which, to me, seem fairly, they should be able to answer them, really, and they can't answer them.
Now, which I think sheds light on how this cover-up, if it is a cover-up, and if the hypothesis is true, is operating, because I think Stelzner probably believes that that thing went to Mars and landed on Mars. So it's a combination, in my opinion, it's a combination of his ego and him actually fooling himself that that's happened. So he's probably been recruited. They've maybe done a personality profile on people who they are recruiting for these lead positions, and maybe people further down the chain perhaps know that the thing isn't landing on Mars, and the vast majority of them on the team are being duped. That's just my opinion, which you'll see why I think that later on in the program.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to say that you know, when we spoke about this, and I'm still kind of hedging my bets on this one. I'm not saying that the rovers aren't on Mars.
Andrew's on the fence.
I'm definitely on the fence, and I don't mind saying that in this case. But like you say, when you stack these things up that we're looking at, it really gives you pause for thought. And I think the problem is that you think, well, what's happened to all this engineering effort? What's happened? You know, they've spent all this money and everything, and we've got these images which are allegedly from Mars, but what really are they? What are we really seeing, and what have they really done? And that's what's hard to believe, that somehow they could have done all of this as a fake. It's hard to believe that it could have been a whole fake.
Now let's come on to the images. You mentioned the images, and let's come on to them. Just to point out, all of these images that I'm going to show you are from NASA's published websites, and I've got the reference numbers for the images, which will be put on the screen so you can look them up yourself from NASA's website. Now, the first one we're going to look at is a Curiosity Rover image, image number PIA 16204. We'll put the whole image on the screen there, and you can see I've got a little red square marked at the left hand side of the screen there, because some of the evidence in these images is quite hard to see when you look at the whole landscape. But let's just zoom in to that little area that I've highlighted there, and what do we see on the screen there between these two rocks?
Well, there appears to be a small rodent in the picture.
Right. Well, in my opinion, that's some kind of rodent, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I'd seen this picture before, actually, before we had this conversation, and it is very strange that you see that image and you think, well, is that just a chance, you know, line of sight effect that we're seeing, or it really does look, as you say, like some type of lemming? Or
I originally found it in a video on YouTube, I think by Monty Williams. He thought it was a prairie dog, but if you look closely, it's not a prairie dog. I came to the conclusion that it was most likely a lemming. That's the closest match. And interestingly enough, one of the places where NASA test or claim to test and develop their rovers is in the Canadian Arctic, at a place called Devon Island, a 300-mile long deserted Arctic island, with a 23-kilometre meteorite crater in the middle of it, and there are indeed collared lemmings. It even looks like the right subspecies of lemming,
right,
with a tiny mark on its collar.
It's very, very unusual.
And lemmings have tiny little limbs, because they live in such a cold environment. They have tiny little limbs. They can kind of curl up in their own fur. And indeed, in the photo, you can't see any limbs.
Now, one of the rovers was tested. It is known that they've done tests on a place called Devon Islands.
Yes.
This is the largest unpopulated island in the world, very, very remote. But one of the creatures which is resident on that island and seen regularly is the Arctic lemming. Yeah, and there's we've got a picture of one on the screen there. So, are we looking at, in the Mars image, a picture of a lemming on Devon Island?
Well, this is the question that we need to present ourselves with, don't we? And I mean, that, say, Devon Island is northern Canada, isn't it? So it's in that sort of area, so it is very remote.
Let's have a look at this next image. Again, it's well, I'll give the reference 0109 MR 0684022 000E1 NASA image. And just to the right hand side there, if we zoom into that,
well, again, it wasn't me who initially spotted it. It was somebody on YouTube saying that it looks like a backbone, like a line of vertebrae, some kind of marine species, probably. Clearly,
it's some sort of vertebrae. That's not a random rock formation, in
No.
my opinion.
I would agree with that, and I've shown that image myself in one or two of the presentations that I've done. Yes,
Pretty difficult to describe that as a random rock formation.
Yeah, exactly.
How would an image of a vertebra work itself into the Mars images? Well, again, perhaps it is somewhere like Devon Island where they've tested some of these rovers, a whale that's been beached, or one theory is that we get what are known as walrus graveyards, where hunters will come and kill a load of walruses and they'll take the tusks and all of the stuff that they want, and then they'll just leave the bodies to rot. So you'll get vertebrae lying around the ground as we see there. And we see here on the screen a picture of a whale skeleton. So we're not biologists, so we haven't really identified what type of creature the vertebrae is from, but certainly pretty conclusive to me that that's some animal that's died, that's been on Earth.
Right, and I mean, you know, this brings us to the point of there are a number of these images, and we're going to come on to some more. So we have two alternatives, really. Either we're looking at images from Mars, and Mars once had creatures, you know, like whales, like walruses, going around in its oceans or seas or whatever. Or we're looking at images from the Earth, which are purported to be from Mars, and either of those two gives us a problem with the official story of what's going on.
If you look at the Lemming, it would say it has to have the life's the same as Earth now.
Atmosphere,
How can a lemming exist in the Martian atmosphere with what is it, less than 1%?
Minus 73 degrees centigrade or whatever.
So
There's a few other remarkably bone-like rocks that have turned up in the photographs.
well, let's turn to that one, because we've got that one next.
The best match I could find was Walrus Bones.
So Douglas Gibson has actually suggested that this bone on the surface of Mars is actually a walrus arm bone.
But that walrus forearm definitely seems to be the best match.
Right, so you think...
But if anyone knows more about sea mammalian bones, happy to be corrected.
Yeah, we can see the image there of a walrus skeleton. It does look very similar to some sort of arm bone of a sea creature such as a walrus.
It does, and I mean that particular image I'd not seen before I saw it in your document, the one of this. It does look like a bone, you know, a hip bone or a thigh bone or something, or the walrus equivalent of whatever they would call it on a walrus. Yeah, very unusual.
If they are faking it, they would have to do it in extremely remote parts of the world, and interestingly, in some of the remotest Arctic regions, what they call the Arctic desert regions of the world, you can find what they call walrus graveyards, because walruses, the early hunters a couple hundred years ago, they didn't even have to go out to sea. They could just find a huddle of walruses, because they crawl up on the land and shoot the whole lot of them and just take the tusks.
So we've got lemmings running around, we've got dead walruses and dead whales, and we've got lumps of wood. And are we really suggesting that all that life is existing on a Martian atmosphere with less than 1% of the Earth's atmosphere and carbon dioxide? It's not an atmosphere that can support life like on Earth. So where are these images really being taken?
It makes you wonder.
All right, we'll come on to the next image, which is, as I said, what appears to be a lump of wood.
That's it.
You were aware of this image, Andrew?
Yes.
Before you've seen the document, yeah.
Yeah, I mean this particular image, I'd used this in several presentations I'd done in 2000, probably 2005, 2004, that sort of time period. Not long after it had come out, I saw it posted on the internet for him, and it looked like a lump of 3x2. You know?
And this has come from the Opportunity rover.
Yeah, and it's in a panorama image that you can find. But again, it's a black and white image. Why aren't they giving us colour? You know, as we were saying earlier on, that's
a plank of wood.
Yeah. Let's see. One of the other places, if they are using very remote places on Earth to fake it, one of the other likely locations would be Svalbard or Spitsbergen.
This is another test site.
Where they've also tested lots of Mars rovers, done lots of development work, and on Spitsbergen, there are indeed quite a lot of old railway sleepers that have been washed up because there's been a lot of mining on Svalbard over the centuries.
All right, so that could be from some sort of railway sleeper, because if you were to get hazard, it doesn't look like a fallen tree. It looks like it's been.
It looks like a cut sleeper.
Andrew said a piece of 3x2.
Yeah.
What is the deal with these? Why are we getting so many black and white images? You've got phones in your pocket that take high resolution digital colour images. Why are we not getting these images from Mars?
Yeah. Okay. And another black and white image we have here, which is from the Spirit Rover image. Got the reference there, which appears to show lichen.
Yeah.
It just looks like lichen. What else can it be?
Now again, if that was in colour, it'd probably be absolutely conclusive that was lichen. And we've got an image there which is comparing it to lichen on Earth. And lichen is this sort of parasite which grows on other things.
Sort of like a type of fungus, algae type of thing. I mean, the botanists, I'm sure, will pick me up and they'll tell me it's not a fungus and it's not an algae, but it's that type of growth. It's not. It doesn't really have flowering leaves or anything like that. And it grows on rocks primarily. You don't really notice it growing in soils and that.
There are some kinds of lichen that actually grow in the little gaps in the rock, which you can see. And then there's a nice round one growing on the surface. I don't know exactly what the different subspecies of lichen are.
And now we come on to images of fossils.
One of the ones that Charles Schultz mentioned, which he says is a crinoid, but far more compelling really is a man called Richard Hoover, who's studied fossils all his life and worked for NASA for 40 years, and he says it is absolutely definitely a crinoid.
So the guy who's working for NASA, is he therefore saying that there's crinoid fossils on Mars, or what's he saying? Or is he saying they're fooling us with images from Earth? Does he make a judgment on that?
No, he doesn't.
Right, he just says it's okay.
Perhaps he's worried about his pension.
People who are experts on fossils have looked at this image and can conclude that it's a crinoid fossil, and we've just got it next to a crinoid fossil there, and you can see the similarities with these sort of ridges.
Isn't the logical conclusion that the photographs are coming from the Earth rather than Mars, because these are Earth species of fossils? I think the best one was a crinoid.
Yeah, I mean, this is something again I became aware of on Charles Schultz's site. Or one similar to this. Might not have been this exact image, but he had some similar images, and I've shown them in some of the talks that I've done with trilobites. And there's one that looks like a fossilized octopus that he had as well. So there's a number of these images that, and he points out, as we were saying earlier, that he'd gone through hundreds or even thousands of these images, and they're just like tiny little portions of the image, that he's picked them out from. They're not like really big, so he's had to spend a lot of time looking for them.
So Charles Schultz has written a book called The Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars.
Correct.
And he contends that the Martian service is got a lot of fossils on it. Therefore, there's at one point on the Earth there was microbial or life.
Complex
not
life
microbial
as well,
life, but life.
Yes.
And what we're saying in this hypothesis is, well, hang on, if someone showed you one of Charles Schultz's images, which appears to show a trilobite or a crinoid fossil, what would you think it most likely an image from? Maybe it is taken from Earth.
It's certainly possible.
Okay, now let's look at this next image, which shows a moving rock. So we've got this is from the Spirit Rover. We've got one image which shows a collection of rocks, and then another image taken at a different time from a slightly different angle of the same group of rocks, and we see that there's a rock which has completely disappeared.
Right.
Which we do get sandstorms on Mars, but
well, this is it. I mean, we've already been talking, and we're going to talk probably more about the atmosphere on Mars, and I've already said it's very thin. It's much thinner than on the Earth, so therefore any winds that are running on Mars, that are blowing on Mars, they're going to be much less kind of force on objects on the ground, because the air
less
is thinner.
than 1% the thickness of the Earth atmosphere.
Right.
So it's not going to be able to blow a rock over.
Not really. So you have a problem with that idea of this just being blown over or whatever it is.
So it's not quite so compelling. The pictures do seem very strange, but you can argue that the apparent movement of the rock is a parallax effect, that one of the rocks is actually standing quite a distance behind the other ones. Right. For me, again, it's more interesting because I'm pretty certain they've used CGI to hide something. The rocks themselves look quite bizarre.
Right, now there is another image that I've included in the document, which is an image of the Curiosity Rover, and it's a self-portrait. So the question to be asked is, how did the thing take a photograph of itself without seeing the arm of the camera? Now, NASA have come up with an explanation for this one, and that is that there was 55 images stitched together, which made that image, and that would also possibly explain why the rocks in the background appear different on two different shots.
No, it's just too perfect. No one's quite managed to perfect the process of producing mosaics. NASA claim that they've produced some software to produce a perfect mosaic, and also none of the 55 images, which could only have been taken by the Marley lens, M-A-H-L-I, the Marley lens on the end of the robotic arm. None of those 55 images actually appear anywhere on NASA's own raw image database. And also the NASA claimed that the mosaic was actually put together by an amateur astronomer, which seems to be a clever way of avoiding accountability.
And now we come on to another major area of evidence, Andrew, which is the colours on Mars.
Absolutely.
The first craft or lander was the Viking Mission, and I think it was the first photograph that it sent back was image PIA 00563, which showed a blue sky and a very slightly reddish or brown foreground. NASA then said, oh well, we've made a mistake with that image, the sky isn't that colour, this is how it is. So the official images, or the revised images, is seen below there, which is just completely red. So what do you make of that, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen many of these images now, and you know, probably talk about one or two more, and that story of the image coming through is told by Richard Hoagland, and he said that when the image first came through on the monitors, it had like this bluish, greyish, or greyish blue, perhaps I would say, sky colour, and then somebody said, oh no, that's not right, because the dust is very thick there, you know, and we better recalibrate this image. And they twiddled all the knobs, and lo and behold, the sky went red.
NASA's explanation why they changed that image was that there was suspended dust in the atmosphere. So they're saying that first image wasn't right because there was suspended dust in the atmosphere, so they've corrected it to the second one.
How would they know? How would they know at that point so early on?
As we'll see, NASA have been changing the colours of their images on Mars.
There's this argument been running for years about whether the sky is really red, because they can take a picture using the blue filter and tell us it was taken using a red filter. So then when we replace the red back into the picture, it looks like the sky's red when it never was.
This is from Spirit. They have actually a colour calibration module which has 4 lobes on it, and those should be blue, orange, green and brown in that image, and that's how you tell whether the image is calibrated correctly. Just tell us about that, Andy.
Yeah, so we see this on a couple of and we saw this with some of the Viking images as well, where you have this colour calibration chart, and you know, you can see that these panels which were blue on Earth have turned red when they're on Mars. Right. Now this is not possible by reflected light. You can't, if you have a blue piece of paper or a blue piece of paint and you shine red coloured light onto it, it's not going to show up red, it's going to become like a muddy grey or something. But in these images it shows up red. And so what should be muddy grey shows up red, and that to me shows that there's been colour substitution of the blue colour range for a red colour range.
This is fairly well accepted with a lot of researchers, that they are messing with the colours on Mars, and they're deliberately making the sky look red and the ground look more red.
Yes, I mean, we can say that it's Gil Levin. He said this with analysis he's done. He designed one of the Viking experiments. Holger Isenberg, Goro Adachi. You know, I've looked at this as well. But there's been a number of people that have pointed out these these anomalies.
And of course, there's two explanations, obvious explanations. The first is that the Martian sky is blue and they're trying to hide that fact and make it look red. Or it could be that the images weren't taken on Mars, they were taken on Earth, and the reason why they made them look red is so that they don't look too much like the Earth.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think a lot of the researchers who've said, hey, look, the Martian sky is blue, I think they could be barking up the wrong tree.
It's possible.
We're placing far too much faith in JPL and NASA, and I think we only need to look at their background to decide whether they're really trustworthy.
Starting with a small rodent identified possibly as an Arctic lemming, a lump of wood possibly from an old railway sleeper, the vertebra of a large sea creature, a bone identified possibly as a walrus arm bone, lichen growing on rocks, a crinoid fossil, and also photographs which prove NASA have falsified the colours in many of their images. The question which arises is, do these anomalies provide evidence that all the images from the Mars rovers are in fact being taken from remote locations on the Earth? Coming up in today's show, we examine more evidence and discuss the possible reasons why this might have been done.
Now let's come on to impossible weather, Andrew. We just need to point out what the Martian atmosphere is like first. It's composed primarily of carbon dioxide, 95.3%, and is 100 times less dense than the Earth. The atmospheric pressure is much lower than on Earth, 600 pascals compared to 101,000 pascals on Earth. Current scientific thinking states that there is no liquid water on Mars, and it can only exist as vapor or ice due to the atmospheric conditions. So just expand on that for us, Andrew. Why can't you have rain or flowing water on Mars?
Yeah, well, if the atmospheric pressure is much lower, then any water that would normally be in a liquid form will immediately, because there's no pressure to make it sort of form into a liquid, it just becomes vapor. So you don't have liquid water, and of course, because the temperature is very cold, then you wouldn't get really droplets of vapor, or particles of vapor, whatever you want to call them. It would form layers of ice.
Mm-hmm. It's either ice or vapor, not running water, or droplets and that kind of thing.
Because of the low pressure.
All right, well, let's look at this next image, which appears to show some sort of moisture on the lens of the rover, which it could be dust, but you would say it's not, or we would say it's not dust because it clears up a day or two later.
Right, so I mean, I hadn't seen this image before you brought it to my attention. I think it was Douglas that mentioned it to you. And so what are we looking at? Why is this dust? I mean, we don't really know for sure, but as my understanding, they don't have any way of cleaning the lenses. So if this dust is blown up from the surface and somehow stuck to the lens, it should stay there forever. There's no way to clean it off, or until there's another sufficient gust of wind to blow it all off again, which is that what happened? Well,
there's no windscreen wipers.
There's no windscreen wipers that I'm aware of.
Right. So also in this image, we see, if we look carefully at the soil and we animate the soil over a period of about 7 days, by putting one image next to in a sequence, we can see that clearly the soil looks like it's damp and is moving in a particular direction.
Because that's the real giveaway. You can see there's definitely something soaking away into the sand over the subsequent days. I mean, it's really glaringly obvious, and yet NASA's still claiming there's no water on Mars.
So would you say that shouldn't be able to happen on Mars either, Andrew?
Well, it's not according to what they tell us about the atmosphere.
I think it's just colour changes in the sand as the moisture drains into the sand. I don't think the sand itself is actually moving.
Right.
I mean, one thing we did talk about in email, I think, Richard, is to be more sure of this, we'd need to say, let's just say, for example, we were able to find out where these rovers really were, if they were on the Earth. We would need to try and find out the weather conditions for that place, and then see if we could match those with anything that was shown on the sequence of rover images. That's one thing we haven't looked at, and I'd be interested from anybody that would be able to do that.
Right, and we've got another pair of images there which were obviously taken at different times, slightly different angle, which suggests that perhaps the soil has moved from one to the other.
And this is something that Charles Schultz has he had on his website. I don't know whether it's in his book, that we've seen we can clearly see evidence that it looks like there's been some type of water flow which has smoothed over some of the grooves on the ground, the channels that are filled up with silt. It's pretty clear to me that this is what's happened in these images.
Now we come on to the cleaning events, because I think it's the Opportunity rover, its solar panels became dusty, and therefore they weren't getting as much power, and the thing conked out, I believe. Is that correct? At some point?
Yeah, very nearly conked out. I think they even claimed that the memory on the rover was starting to malfunction due to lack of power, and then miraculously the solar panels were suddenly clean again.
Right, so the solar panels were suddenly clean. Now, they put this down to some kind of sandstorm. Just to tell us about that, Douglas.
Yeah, well, they've given us photographs with dust devils going past in the background, so they're claiming that these dust devils have been periodically cleaning the solar panels. But actually, there's an article in New Scientist saying that all these cleaning events have happened in the middle of the night, which seems unlikely with if dust devils is the
dust devil will be more likely to occur during the day, you think?
That's right, but also the Martian atmosphere is something like 1/200th of the density of the Earth's atmosphere.
So any wind is going to be 1/200th times less powerful.
Exactly.
Right. So it's difficult to think how something like that could clean a solar panel that's become covered in dust.
That's right. And
in some of the images, people have alleged that the cleaning has been highly selective, in that some of the hinges, there's a photograph where you showed me of some of the hinges of the rover appear to be sparkling clean with no dust on them, and the solar panels more dust on them.
That's right. There was a very, very interesting article by Ted Twinemeyer saying that some of the solar panels appeared to have been cleaned whilst others hadn't. Also, the hinges on the solar panels appeared to be clean when the solar panels were still dirty, and he even believes there are fingerprints in the dust on the solar panels.
Right, so we can have a look at this image here, which appears to show a finger or a thumbprint on the edge of the solar panel, if we just zoom in on that. And one thing I was going to do is perhaps do some calculations on that, what appears to be a fingerprint, just to see if it's the right size for a fingerprint. It certainly seems unlikely that if a solar panel has got so dirty that it can no longer recharge a battery, that it's starting to malfunction, that suddenly it all comes back to life again.
If you park your car in the street for 6 months, it gets really dirty, does it ever end up clean again?
Yeah. That's a good analogy.
Well, I suppose the rain might, but then of course there's no rain on Mars. So.
Now, I've included some of the NASA images from Apollo, just to show that there's proof that NASA do fake their images, right, on the moon landings. Yeah, so we're just going to look at a few of them now. So this is evidence of previous faking. That's why I've put this in. A chap called David Percy has taken 4 NASA images, which is NASA image AS171342047 to 20443, and he stitched them together because they're different sections of the moon. And then he's taken another set, NASA image AS17147224494 to 22521, and he stitched those together. So he's got 2 composite images, and he's compared them, and we can see there. Tell us the anomaly that we're looking at.
Yeah, so that image is essentially you have a problem with the parallax, because the backdrop for those 2 sets of images is identical, or it's very nearly identical, and yet in one image we have the lunar module in the foreground, fairly close to the camera, and then in the other it's way over to the right, and we have an astronaut, whichever one it is, I don't know, in the foreground. Yet the backdrop is identical, as if we're, what are the chances of having the camera pointed with exactly the same field of view?
And just to explain the problem with that, Andrew, and that is that the lunar lander that you see there in the foreground lands on the surface of the moon, and then when the astronauts leave, the top part kind of explodes away, and then they get back to Earth.
Yeah, so there's no way for it to move after it's landed.
So the lander can't move on the surface of the moon at all. It has to stay in the same position. We see it in two different positions on the same mission.
Yeah.
So people have looked at this and have concluded that what you're looking at there is a stage set with the front projection system generating the artificial background on there.
Right.
Probably with the help of Stanley Kubrick.
Something like that, yeah, because he was using that method in 2001: A Space Odyssey around the same time.
The Mars rover missions, or Mars rover deception, in my opinion, it's a continuation in many ways of the Apollo deception. All the evidence suggests that Stanley Kubrick faked a lot of the moon photographs on one of his big sets, and perfected techniques for joining, or as best as possible, joining the foreground with the background to create the illusion of a whole landscape. But of course they can do that now using CGI, so you can film outdoors and put in whatever background you like. Which is exactly what I think they're doing, because obviously they need to disguise whatever skylight, whatever is in the background, which is likely to give away their location. They would need to replace that with something less identifiable.
All right, well, let's come on to another NASA image from the moon mission, which is supposedly a family photograph on the surface of the Earth, and we have featured this one before.
On the surface of the moon. You said you want to say that again, yeah.
Well, it probably is the surface of the Earth.
Freudian slip.
Yeah. Yeah, we showed the famous clip of Andrew Johnson putting his family photograph into the oven along with his dinner.
So here we have a family photograph, and over here we have an oven, and this oven is set to 100 degrees centigrade, and I'm now going to put this photograph in the oven, which is cooking some of my dinner, and then I'm going to watch it through the glass. And that you can see that in very short order trying to get better light, but you'll see it when I open it. This is curling up within seconds, so I think that's a pretty convincing demonstration. And here it is. You can see it there curled up, and that's only at 100 degrees centigrade. That's right, and I'd like to assure viewers I wasn't on the moon when I did that.
So just explain why you put your family photograph in the oven with your dinner.
Yeah, well, this was again one that caught my eye because it's a photograph from NASA on the moon, which you can look at based on the physical properties of materials rather than lighting effects. So the claim is that the photograph is on the surface of the moon. If you look up the official sort of temperature of the surface of the moon, the average temperature is 100 degrees centigrade. In sunlight it's probably going to be 170, 180 degrees centigrade, something like that.
So as I said in the last show, it's higher than boiling water on the surface of the moon. Absolutely.
So if you have a piece of photographic paper, an ordinary photographic paper, it does what's called convolution. It convolves, it curls up. So that photograph should be curling up, what we're looking at there, but it's perfectly flat. It's in a plastic bag, which doesn't appear to have been, and if you heat a plastic bag with a hairdryer, you'll see it all starts to scrunch up or at least change shape. We're not seeing any of that with that photograph. That is not on the surface of the moon. End of.
All right, and then we've got another image here of a lunar rover, and there's all kinds of problems with the lunar rovers, which we covered in a previous show. The fact that they don't even fit into the lunar module, there's no tracks showing there, various other problems with the technology. For example, the operating temperature range of the batteries is completely out.
Right.
So there's a lot of problems with the lunar rovers.
That's right. Again, that's worthy of a little bit of study for people to look at the problems in those areas. Yeah, definitely.
And that's just a few of the faked NASA moon images. Let's now look at some of these testing sites on Earth. Let's use the terminology that they use at NASA. They call them a Mars analog site. Now I'm just going to read out what a Mars analog site is. It is a location on Earth where some environmental conditions, geologic features, biological attributes, or combinations thereof may approximate in some specific way those thought to be encountered on Mars, either at present or earlier in the planet's history. Studying such sites leads to new insights into the nature and evolution of Mars, the Earth, and life. So what they're saying is they're looking for places on the Earth which are a bit like what Mars might look like.
Yes, and have similar conditions, you know, with a rocky terrain, or, you know, cold temperatures, or very dry, you know, and this sort of thing.
Now, one of these sites is a place called Devon Island, which just so happens to be the largest unpopulated island on Earth. So they're choosing extremely remote places. I'm sure they could find somewhere just as with the same weather conditions, which is a lot easier to access.
Nobody has ever lived on Devon Island.
There's no flights to Devon Island.
No, there's no.
What about ships?
Well, you could sail there, I suppose.
Would you need your own?
They've had to make their own tiny landing strip, but to get supplies in and out.
In the document, I suggest in the hypothesis why they're choosing these remote sites, and that's so that no one can actually come and photograph the landscapes that they're using for the faked Mars rover images.
Right. Because I mean, these aren't places where you're going to go out for a Sunday afternoon trip, or even on an expedition, you know, with kayaks or whatever. You wouldn't go to these sorts of places.
Even if you had your own helicopter, you'd be hard pushed to get to some of these places. One of them is well, the one on Devon Island is next to the Horton Crater, which is a huge ancient crater.
When I first looked at Devon Island on my laptop screen, with Devon Island filling my laptop screen, Horton Crater was a great big red spot, about 6 millimeters across, I'd have said, right in the middle of the screen, absolutely unmissable. And yet when I went back a week later to look closer, they'd changed the pictures, so you now can't see Horton Crater. If you have the whole of Devon Island on your computer screen, the crater is now completely invisible. I think they swapped a high altitude summer photograph for a winter photograph when there's a slight covering of snow, so all the red soil and rock thrown up by the impact is no longer visible on Google Earth.
That's also very interesting, because it alleged that the Mars rovers, or at least one of them, is in the Gusev crater in you know, on Mars.
On Mars.
The Opportunity rover, yes, is supposed to be exploring the edge of a 23-kilometre crater on Mars.
Right.
That's a coincidence, isn't it?
So when I read that into a document, I didn't realise that there was an impact crater on Devon Island, or near where this test station was.
Now, obviously, if you're faking the Mars photographs, you need somewhere extremely dry with no vegetation. And practically the first meteorite crater I looked at was this 23-kilometre crater up on Devon Island in the Canadian Arctic. So I just googled, it's called Horton Crater, and the third link that came up was NASA testing Mars rovers there. Now they would say, oh well, we have to go to the most Mars-like locations to test our rovers, but I'm not convinced. They'd be better off testing them in the Mojave Desert, you know, right next to where the NASA headquarters are.
Mm-hmm. So of course they would argue that they chose that site specifically because they knew they were going to send it to you know, a cratered area on Mars. Right. That's why they chose that particular site. But you know,
an extremely remote island which they've now surrounded with high-tech listening devices to keep away any unexpected visitors. They've been running, they're called the AMAZE expeditions, AMASE, Arctic Mars Analog Svalbard expeditions, that have been running for about 10 years, I think. And they have been to a few different locations on Svalbard or Spitsbergen. But they usually seem to head towards a place called Bokfjorden, and also Woodfjorden, which are also in what they call this Arctic desert region. It doesn't actually get very much snow at all. It's Woodfjorden in particular looks almost completely dry, certainly on Google Earth.
We've got other sites, one in Utah, which if you look at these photographs of the Mars analogues, as they call them, it does look very much like the photographs that they've been sending back, both on Devon Island and in the Utah one. And if you go on to, because we're going to come on to the Mars Society in a moment.
Oh yeah.
And these Mars analog sites, what they do is they get sort of a cylindrical tin can type building, and they'll install it in the middle of the desert in Utah or up in Devon Island, and it has a few stories in it, and scientists will live there for months on end because it simulates a landed spacecraft that they're living in, right? And scientists actually compete to have a go in it, right? To live in it for sort of months at a time, and they get these awards for so apparently it's very, very prestigious for someone studying universities to get their PhD who live in this tin can for 6 months in the middle of nowhere, and they actually get awards for it.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, great.
Yeah. Whatever floats your boat, I suppose.
Yeah, it takes all sorts to make a world, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
So tell us, where do you think Curiosity Rover actually is in reality?
The Curiosity Rover has definitely passed several walrus graveyards, in my opinion, which means it's most likely on Svalbard, or it could also be on Bear Island, which is between Svalbard and Norway. Which also has walrus graveyards and is relatively flat.
What about the Lemming image though? Is that, because that's...
Well, they're using CGI to join together various locations. Like I was saying, they can have they have to have one location in the foreground that they can use their robotic arm to microscopically examine, but they can have a completely different part of the world, or even just CGI in the background. Some of the hills look distinctly unreal. The Spirit Rover seems to have been done almost entirely on Devon Island, I'd say.
Right.
The
Curiosity, you think, is more likely to be Svalbard? Is that what you're saying?
The Curiosity Rover, I think they've used bits of Svalbard and a lot of the Atacama Desert.
Right. So let's assume that the hypothesis is correct. I would imagine the best way to expose this conspiracy is for somebody to find where these landscapes have been filmed and photograph them and compare them, so we can be absolutely sure and absolutely categoric of which landscapes they've used. Would you go along with that, Douglas?
Yeah, absolutely. But what I found out fairly quickly was that, of course, they've been very, very careful to use locations that can't quite be identified. So even if there are any identifiable hills in the background, they'll use CGI to put something really indistinct in the background. In fact, that's the kind of the distinctive feature I've noticed of all the photographs, is the lack of distinctive features in the background.
Right, but perhaps, as we've seen with the fossils, the lemming, the vertebrae, sometimes they do slip through the net. So maybe we can set a challenge, the Rich Planet Find Mars on Earth challenge, to any budding explorers out there who might happen to have their own seafaring vessel or helicopter or light aircraft, who maybe want to try and find where some of these sites are and provide documented evidence. Assuming they are on Earth, Douglas, do you think they're faking it with just a camera, or do you think they've actually got a Mars rover there, the whole thing simulated, and it's so the images are coming from the rover? Or do you think it's just a guy with a camera and a tripod? They can insert the bit of the rover that's seen.
They're using all the techniques. Sometimes the rover's there, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes they're using CGI to stitch together various components to create a realistic landscape.
Now, when we've been recording these shows all about the Mars rover missions and the fact that they may have been faked, an article appeared in Mail Online and in other mainstream publications entitled "I Saw Men Walking on Mars in 1979. Former NASA employee claims there was a secret manned mission to the Red Planet." So this is somebody who's rang Coast to Coast AM, which is an American radio program, and I think this caller, called Jackie, this call was at least as long ago as 2007. Because it was George Norrie interviewing John Lear, and the last time John Lear was on that radio program was 2007. So they've dragged up this story from over 7 years ago of a woman who claimed to work for NASA and who said that some of the Viking images had people in them. But it seems dubious to me because this person describes moving images and also says that when the Viking craft was moving around the surface of Mars, well, in fact it wasn't, it was a stationary lander. So I'm very skeptical of this story, Douglas, but mainstream media have put this up strangely when we are putting out this research. One aspect that I particularly objected to in this article, it says conspiracy forums have been set ablaze this week after a lady claiming to be a former NASA employee said she had seen humans on Mars. Well, it is bullshit, because this call took place at least as long ago as 2007. So conspiracy forums have not been set ablaze this week. Some people may have been talking about it on the internet because they've put it in Mail Online and in other mainstream publications. Certainly any person who read this article and thought there was at least some truth in it, that would then muddy the waters for this, because this does not mention the theory that the Mars rovers never left the Earth and the photographs are coming back from Earth. What it's saying is, hey, someone at NASA saw a person in one of the Viking images. That means there's a secret space program and people are walking around Mars. So it's not questioning for 1 minute the fact that Viking might not be on Mars, which is why it's disinfo, in my opinion.
The problem, I think, is that the Daily Mail have tried to attach that story to a really bizarre story about nuclear explosions on Mars. So they seem to try to lump her in with with a very bizarre story.
As I said, we'll come on to the Mars Society. Why does NASA need a separate organisation, completely separate, to run these Mars analog sites, where they're doing all of this research for the rovers and testing components and this kind of thing? But this Mars Society, it actually says on the internet that it's not a company. It is a not-for-profit organisation and is funded fully by American organisations, which I would imagine means NASA. So they've created this separate organisation called the Mars Society, which is running all of these Mars analog stations. So why do they need a separate organisation? And it's run by this guy, Dr. Robert Zubrin, founder of the Mars Society.
But yes, the Mars Society does pop up in all the right places to be orchestrating some kind of deception.
You know, we could comment on some of his lectures. Have you seen any of them, Andrew?
I've heard him on Coast to Coast, but I've not seen his lectures, so no, I can't really comment on those.
Right. Well, Zubrin is sort of a proponent of manned Mars missions. So what he's campaigning for is to try and get the funding and the motivation to build rockets that can get to Mars, create some sort of little colony, and then get back safely. And he goes into all of the logistics as to how many spacecraft you'd need, the fact that you need to create artificial gravity on the way to Mars by spinning it round and creating gravity. So, but if you want my view on it, his lectures are just like a pipe dream.
I'm going to talk humans to Mars within a decade, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think it would have to be done in that kind of time frame if you're going to do it. I'm going to talk at some length as to how I think it could be done. In fact, I'm going to show you 2 different ways it could be done. Humans to Mars within a decade. Okay, is that really possible? NASA's current, timeline is to do it around the year 2047. Mars Direct was actually conceived by a team led by me and another engineer named David Baker at Martin Marietta, which became Lockheed Martin, in 1990. This is the mission sequence chart for the Mars Direct plan. You can launch to Mars every 2 years, and we're going to be launching 2 boosters every 2 years to Mars in order to do this. Well, first of all, any space operation requires an appropriate launch vehicle, and we set ourselves the task of designing one in the Saturn V class out of available technology, shuttle technology. So you have 4 shuttle main engines, a couple of solids, the external tank core, hydrogen oxygen upper stage, and a 10-meter fairing, or 33 feet if you work at Lockheed Martin. And this could lift 120 tons to low Earth orbit. But more importantly, it could use this upper stage to send 47 tons on direct trans-Mars injection, or 59 tons on trans-lunar injection. And that is how we wanted to do the mission. Just lift and throw and let it go. Send the payload to the planet, the same booster that launched it in the first place. That's how we've done every real unmanned planetary mission. That's how we did the real Apollo missions to the moon. No one's ever done a mission to anywhere by lifting things to the space station and waiting for the interplanetary cruiser to return from Saturn and be refitted to load the payload on it and then go back out. No, just lift and throw and let it go. And RV. And what this is a little rocket ship for returning from Mars to Earth in the terminal stage of the mission. But no one's in it when it goes out the first time. Or a crew of 4 for a 6-month voyage from Mars back to Earth, landing site number 3. So this is an actual photograph of the base. What you see here, here's the Earth return vehicle. There's the cabin, the 2 propulsion stages, the intakes for the chemical processing unit, which is built into the landing stage that acts as the takeoff pad for the rest of it. Here's the reactor in the crater in the background, the habitat, upper stage where they live, the upper deck where they live. Lower deck is the garage for the little pressurized rover, a couple of solar panels, uses backup power if you have to turn the reactor off. You also have backup power by running the engine of the rover or the light truck, which may be hard to see, but it's sitting over here. It's an unpressurized vehicle, which is also the backup for this one. And then this thing here is an inflatable greenhouse. This is not a mission critical element. It's an experiment in learning how to grow crops on Mars in Martian soil, Martian sunlight, Martian gravity, Martian water for the benefit of future missions and future bases. Now, after a number of these missions have occurred in different places, you'll know where you want to develop a major base, and you could do that by landing a lot of the HABs in the same place and mating them up. These are second-generation HABs here who landing legs can articulate not only up and down, but also side to side.
Using rocket technology to get manned missions to Mars, I don't think they would achieve it with rockets. They need something more advanced. And I suspect that the whole ethos of what he's doing masks the secret space program, which we've covered in other
yes.
in other
yes. And I mean, when I read this Mars Society in your document, I was familiar with Zubrin, but I didn't really know. I just thought he was just like some space enthusiast. I did not know that they were directly involved with managing some of these sites, and that is very peculiar. And the thing that I'd add to that is that, again, what some people don't realise is that a lot of these Mars images have been through a private company before they get to the public. That's Maling Space Science Systems, MSSS. Why are these images being released through a private company before they're available for public consumption? That's another huge question.
And Zubrin did work for Lockheed Martin, who develop secret aircraft, and I wasn't able to find out what he actually did when he worked for Lockheed Martin. I've picked out a quote from one of Zubrin's lectures where he says, "The idea that we cannot go to Mars until much more advanced propulsion systems that can get us to Mars in 30 days is not a valid argument, and I believe it is disingenuous as well." Now, I find that 30 days quote very interesting, because when I give my lecture about Ed Fouché's TR-3B, I suggested that they've already got the capability to get to Mars within 4 weeks. It's a very similar time period.
It is, isn't it?
So does Zubrin know something that he's not letting on? Because all of his lectures are based on rocket technology and nothing more advanced than that. So,
I mean, that brings also, I think there's another group called the Planetary Society, which also has, I think, a similar kind of language about space exploration in general. And I know that one of the people that's associated with that is Robert Picardo. So this is something I've got from Carl James, and he's been involved with people at JPL as well, Robert Picardo, and he played the holographic Doctor in Star Trek Voyager. So that's a connection worth looking into, and how that, I think we're sort of just touching on a whole sort of other area, how this perception management it operates, with these things like the Mars Society, the Planetary Society, which seem like these benign, organisations intended to promote interest in the space program, but they don't really. They'll poo-poo any idea that there's secret stuff is there.
Yeah. Do you think this could be masking a secret space program?
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah.
You actually think that physics changes as you get further away from Earth? So
that's right. I don't think they can get anyone beyond the Van Allen radiation belts.
Right. So for all you don't rule out the secret space program,
there may well be. Anti-gravity definitely exists. I've got Victor Schauberger's books somewhere. His work was sequestered by the Nazis right back in the 30s. I think they called it torsion physics, which leads absolutely straight into your work on the TR3B.
Now, in the final section, I've discussed what the reason might be. So let's say that the hypothesis is true, that they're faking all of these missions to Mars. One would imagine it's to conceal something which perhaps is on Mars, and I've listed what may be there. Evidence of past advanced civilizations, human or otherwise, inhabited man-made bases that have already been set up in secret spacecraft or spaceports, the fact that the planet's makeup might be significantly different to accepted scientific theory, and I think Douglas Gibson is of that mind.
The physics of Mars is probably completely different to Earth, and that's essentially what they're hiding, what they don't want us thinking about.
Right. Do you want to expand on that as to what you think it might be like on Mars?
Well, my background is, like you say, in theosophy, in the theosophical worldview, rather than consciousness evolving as a kind of peripherally around matter. Matter has evolved from consciousness. Now, that sounds like I'll be accused of being unscientific, but actually you can't prove either of those sets of assumptions. It's just as valid to start from that different standpoint.
Let me share that with you then, Douglas, because I've not delved into a great deal into this thing called consciousness on which planet, and scientists will agree, or some scientists will agree, that in order to observe the universe, observe everything that there is, there must be consciousness, and that consciousness must be detached in some way or different in some way from physical matter or even space. So you have to have consciousness in order to experience the world, and this consciousness element is possibly vastly underplayed or even completely ignored in modern science. But what Douglas is saying is that the consciousness is probably the most important of the two.
Yeah, consciousness itself is more fundamental than matter, in my opinion. The problem kind of goes back to the split between alchemy and science about 500 years ago. So science itself kind of grew out of alchemy. Newton himself started out as an alchemist. What seems to be forgotten along the way is that science itself can still be placed back within a larger alchemical context, if you like, which does indeed say that when you travel certain distances away from the Earth, all our physical constants start to change. The speed of light becomes different, which also ties in with Rupert Sheldrake's talk. Was it earlier this year?
There are other things that people have suggested whereby the non-physical element of humans, our soul, if you want to call it that, somehow resonates with the planet itself, and that by taking your physical body away from the Earth, you're disconnecting it from some kind of field, maybe a morphic field or the akashic field, and that that you would lose your marbles if you travel more than, let's say, 1 million miles from the Earth.
Well, exactly. I mean, I try to avoid sort of terms like astral and try to use modern scientific terms, which you can do instead. But just what you were talking about just then in Nexus magazine in August, they had an article about the strange experiences of the Russian cosmonauts, experience exactly the things you've just been talking about, altered states of consciousness once you travel a certain distance from the Earth. So there's a change in your consciousness and in matter itself. So when you get to the Van Allen radiation belts, the radiation you're experiencing isn't it isn't really floating around in space, which is a kind of questionable concept in itself. It's actually radiation coming from the atoms of your own body, your own spaceship. It's the beginnings of this, I suppose I'd have to call it an alchemical change in the atoms of your body, but also in your consciousness as well. It's a change in the relationship between the two, which is very, very interesting. I mean, it's just a huge, it's a whole area of science that we're being very carefully
steered away from.
Exactly, and specifically by NASA.
And if it were true, it would turn everything on its head.
Absolutely.
You're saying that the cover-up in this is something quite profound and fundamental, rather than just the fact that there might be aliens on Mars.
Exactly.
You're saying it's something fundamental about the understanding of everything that is.
Absolutely. It's about the relationship between consciousness and matter. What they used to call alchemy, but which you can look at in absolutely strictly scientific modern ways. There's nothing unscientific or irrational about thinking about consciousness itself.
Right. Okay.
And it changes everything when you do.
What came first, consciousness or matter?
Exactly.
Have we got a situation where the rovers are really on Earth, but the orbiters are really going around Mars, or are the orbiters not going around Mars either? You know, and we're seeing some other images. That's a question I think that would need to be resolved. Or have they somehow managed to set things up such that, you know, we're going to end up arguing about the authenticity of all the images and call all the images into question? Because this is something we've seen that happen with 9/11 imagery as well, which, you know, we haven't got time to go into. But so the overall overarching thing, I think, is to cover up secret technology. That's so these rover programs have now become the equivalent of Apollo, in that a lot of good minds, you know, with highly skilled technical abilities, detailed technical knowledge, they're now soaked up into those sorts of programs, and they're not going to be sort of entertaining the idea of black programs, secret technologies, and this sort of thing. They're all helping unwittingly to keep all of that covered up. That it may just be that the rover program is all part of that perception management operation. That's quite possible.
It may well be that they put the rover on a rocket and then just crashing into the back of the moon, or you know, into the ocean, and then they're all being duped by images that are being sent back by some other covert team.
Right.
I think unless we have a completely independent citizen-based space program where Tom, Dick and Harry can build their own craft and get it to Mars and then go and film their technology on Mars, I'm not going to believe it. Do you see what I mean? Independent verification.
Yeah. And I mean, if we look at how difficult that is, I mean, if we take we talked a little bit about this, of the recent crash of the Virgin Spaceship 2 that broke up just after it was released from the plane. I mean, that's a kind of a civilian space program.
It's. I don't buy what happened there. To me, they're trying to put into the public's mind that anything above the Earth's atmosphere is really difficult, folks. There's no way civilians can manage it.
Right.
Whether Branson's in on that or not, I don't know. I've stuck my neck out and said I'm 75% sure. I think Andrew's right on the fence, but you're convinced.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I say, I only intend to spend an hour kind of dismissing the idea, and the whole subject, every time I've looked, it's exactly the same as Apollo. Like I say, you take any aspect and try and get to the bottom of the science behind it, and pretty soon everything's falling apart in your hands.
And once you become convinced, do you feel annoyed about it?
Oh, I did initially, yeah. I mean, you do. The same as with Apollo. This is one of the biggest problems. What's that famous saying? It's difficult to deceive people, but it's even harder to convince them that they have been deceived.
Yeah.
Because then, of course, their pride's involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes, when you try and broach a subject like this, people start getting angry.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. But you've got over that.
Yeah. I've got over it.
You start. It comes to the point where you actually start to laugh at it. I did manage to get a photograph of the operators taken from behind their shoulders, and we'll just have a look at what they're looking at on the screen. Remember, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.